Welcome to the deep dive. We've got, well, a mountain of research here. Articles, white papers, you name it.
Yeah, quite the stack.
And we're going to boil it all down for you into the really essential stuff you can actually use. Today, it's kind of a complex journey we're on.
It really is.
We're looking at the landscape of wealth, specifically the mechanics, the risk involved, how you actually do things, the execution, and, well, all those bigger unpredictable forces. Things like macro trends that shape success in real estate and, investing generally.
That's exactly it. Our goal today, clarity. We've pulled together sources from, well, fields that seem pretty separate on the surface. Everything from tiny details in tax law to the behavioral science behind habits, all the way up to like huge global financial meltdowns and deep historical policy stuff.
Stuff that goes way back.
Way back. And they might look unrelated, but they're all connected, really intrinsically linked. They all feed into whether you can build and, crucially, keep wealth. So our job is to kind of synthesize all of that.
To connect the dots.
Yeah, to understand the systems, the repeatable actions, the financial structures that, actually make the difference between success and failure in whatever serious thing you're trying to do.
Exactly. We're trying to get past the simple advice, work hard, save money. Important, sure, but we need to understand the plumbing underneath all that. How do we make money actually work for us, not just the other way around?
Yeah.
So let's unpack it. Let's start with maybe the biggest engine for real estate wealth, the thing that makes it accessible, financial leverage. Okay, so when we talk about building wealth fast, you often hear it's, a game for people who are already rich.
Right. That's the common perception.
But real estate seems to offer something different, doesn't it? Something accessible through leverage. Can you maybe define what financial leverage really is and how it kind of levels the playing field for, say, the average person, someone who isn't already a millionaire?
Sure. Financial leverage, at its core, it's just borrowing money at an interest rate that's hopefully significantly lower than the return you expect to make when you invest that borrowed money.
Yep.
Think of it like controlling a really big asset, say a house, with only a small slice of your own money. And this is key because it lets the common man, as the sources put it, potentially grow wealth at rates that usually only the super wealthy get to see.
Because they have huge balance sheets already.
Exactly. You're essentially using someone else's, the bank's money, to boost your own return on the cash you actually put in, your equity.
And the reason real estate is so good for this compared to, getting a personal loan or borrowing against stocks.
Yeah.
It's about the collateral, right? The actual property.
Precisely. Real estate is, well, it's physical. You can touch it. It's generally seen as relatively stable, much more so than, say, stocks can be day to day. So lenders, banks, they see loans backed by property as reliable, manageable risk. And that security, that underlying asset, is what allows an average person to walk into a bank and borrow a huge amount, maybe $400,000, sometimes more.
From a total stranger.
From a total stranger. At an interest rate that might be under 4%, sometimes even lower these days. Just the scale of borrowing available to a regular person against a house, it's one of the most powerful drivers of wealth out there.
So let's make that concrete. If I put, say, $50,000 down to buy a $500,000 property.
Okay.
And that property goes up 10% in value in a year, that's $50,000 in appreciation. But I didn't make $50,000 on the $500,000 asset value. I actually made $50,000 on my initial $50,000 cash. That's a 100% return on my actual money.
That's the math. That's leverage amplifying your gain. It's powerful stuff. But, and this is a huge but, we have to talk about the danger immediately.
The flip side.
Because leverage is absolutely 100% a double-edged sword. It magnifies those gains, yeah, but it magnifies losses just as much, sometimes even more painfully.
And we saw that play out horrifically back in 2007, 2008 during the housing crash. Can you maybe walk us through what happens, like the mechanics and the psychology, when that amplification goes the wrong way?
Absolutely. Let's use the example from the source, homeowner Hank.
Okay.
So Hank buys a $100,000 house, but he uses 100% financing, zero money down, maximum leverage.
It's maximum leverage.
Now, everything's fine and dandy as long as prices are going up or even just staying flat. But when the market turned, when it corrected, and the value of Hank's house dropped to, say, $80,000, instantly he's underwater or inverted. He still owes the bank the full $100,000, but the house is only worth $80,000.
And that's not just a number on paper, is it? It becomes a real trap.
It is absolutely a trap, psychologically, logistically.
Okay.
If Hank then loses his job or needs to move, He can't just sell the house.
Because he'd still owe money after the sale. Exactly. He'd sell for $80,000, give that to the bank, and still owe them $20,000. He's stuck. That debt limits every option. He can't move easily for work. He can't refinance because there's no equity. He can't tap into equity he never really had.
Right.
So when owners who are leveraged to the hilt, like that face any kind of economic stress, that lack of options, it often leads straight to just walking away. Strategic default.
Yeah.
Foreclosure.
Yeah.
That Hank example, it perfectly shows how maximizing leverage can turn what might have been just a market dip into a complete life-changing financial catastrophe.
So the aim is always for positive leverage. Can you just quickly define that distinction again?
Sure. Positive versus negative leverage. It's a pretty simple comparison, actually. Is the return you're getting from the debt, like the appreciation and cash flow, higher or lower than the cost of that debt, meaning the interest rate you're paying?
Got it.
Positive leverage means you're effectively making money on the money you borrowed. Negative leverage means it's costing you more to hold the debt than the asset is returning. You always, always want that debt working harder for you than it costs you. Otherwise, well, you really need to question why you're using leverage in the first place. Hashtag tax fee, key investment strategies, and tax tools.
Okay, so let's shift from the theory of leverage to how people actually use it on the ground. Boots on the ground application. There's a really popular strategy, BRRRR, that seems built around forcing value to create that equity quickly.
Ah, yes, the BRRR strategy. That stands for buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. It's a pretty sophisticated model, really.
How does it work?
Well, you treat the initial purchase almost like a really fast flip. You use expensive short-term money, think hard money loans, private lenders, maybe even cash if you have it, to buy a property that needs work, something distressed.
Okay.
Then you renovate it quickly, smartly. Targeted rehab to boost the value significantly. Once you've forced that value up, and crucially, you've got it stabilized with a paying tenant.
Generating income.
Generating income, exactly. Yeah. Then you go to a traditional bank and get a long-term mortgage. And you use the proceeds from that mortgage to pay off the expensive short-term loan you started with.
Right. But that refinance step, that's where the math absolutely has to work, right? Because banks aren't just going to give you back 100% of whatever you say the new value is, are conservative.
Absolutely crucial. This is the pivot point. When you go to refinance an investment property like that, a bank will typically only lend you up to, say, 75% of the property's new appraised value, the loan-to-value, or LTV.
Okay, 75%.
So for the investor to actually pull off the refinance part and get enough cash out to pay back that initial loan and get their rehab money back, you know, the no money left in the deal dream of BRRR.
Yeah.
That property must appraise for significantly more than what you paid for it, plus what you spent fixing it up. You have to engineer that appreciation before the bank's appraiser ever sets foot in the door. It's all about that forced value creation.
Okay, so you create the wealth through BRRRR. Now, how do you protect it, especially from taxes? That brings us to the 1031 exchange. Why is this such a big deal for investors who plan to hold property long term?
The 1031 exchange, gosh, it's arguably the single most powerful tool in the entire U.S. tax code for real estate investors. What it does is let you defer paying capital gains tax when you sell an investment property.
Defer, not eliminate.
Defer, exactly. Instead of paying tax on your profit right away, you reinvest those proceeds into a similar like-kind replacement property. You're essentially rolling that tax liability forward into the future.
Which lets your money keep working for you.
Hugely. It leverages the time value of money massively in your favor. You can keep compounding your wealth without that tax drag slowing you down every time you reposition an asset.
But knowing the IRS, there have got to be some very strict rules, strings attached.
Oh, absolutely. And these are non-negotiables. You mess these up, the whole deferral goes out the window, and you owe the tax immediately. There are two critical, absolutely immutable deadlines. First, you must formally identify the potential replacement property or properties in writing unambiguously within 45 days of closing the sale on your original property.
45 days. That's not long.
Not long at all, especially in competitive markets. Second, you must actually close on the purchase of that identified replacement property within 180 days of the original sale date.
180 days total, including the first 45.
Correct. And the sources are crystal clear on this. The tax law says these deadlines are absolutely set in stone. There are no extensions from the IRS. Doesn't matter if it's a weekend, a holiday, a personal emergency, you miss that 45-day identification, or the 180-day closing.
Game over. Taxable event.
Taxable event. It forces rapid, decisive action. It's high stakes.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, beyond the 1031, real estate has another pretty unique tax advantage when you want to pull cash out of a property, the tax-free cash-out refinance. Why isn't that cash taxed?
Yeah, this is another huge differentiator for real estate compared to almost anything else. If you sell stock for a profit, you pay capital gains, right?
Right.
If you take a profit distribution from your business, you pay income tax. But with a cash-out refinance in real estate, that cash you pull out is non-taxable.
Why?
Because the IRS doesn't see it as income. They see it as a loan. It's debt. You're simply borrowing against the equity, the appreciated value you've built up in the asset. You haven't technically realized a gain by selling.
Can you give a quick example of how powerful that is?
Sure. Let's say you bought a place years ago for $100,000. Market's been good, maybe you made some improvements, and now it appraises for $300,000. Let's say you still owe $50,000 on the original loan.
Okay.
You do a cash-out refinance, taking out a new loan for, say, $200,000. You pay off the old $50,000 loan, pay some closing costs, and maybe $145,000 or $150,000 lands in your bank account.
Tax-free.
Completely tax-free. Because it's loan proceeds. You haven't triggered a taxable sale. You just have a larger mortgage now. It's a phenomenal way to access capital locked up in your properties without incurring immediate tax. Really distinguishes real estate.
Okay, last piece on the finance fundamentals, basis and depreciation. These seem like core accounting things for tracking tax benefits. Can you break those down?
Right. Your cost basis is basically your starting point for figuring out taxes when you eventually do sell. Generally, it's what you paid for the property plus certain closing costs and fees you paid during the purchase.
And improvements.
Good question. Capital improvements, big things that add significant value or extend the life of the property, like a new roof, an addition, a new HVAC system, those get added to your basis. They increase it. Regular operating expenses like fixing a leaky faucet or painting a room between tenants, those are usually just deductible in the year you spend the money.
Okay, so basis tracks your investment cost. What about depreciation?
Depreciation is, well, it's the government acknowledging that buildings wear out over time. It's an allowance they give you to write off the cost of the building portion of your property over what they deem its useful life.
But not the land. Right.
Critically important. You cannot depreciate land. Land supposedly lasts forever, so you have to allocate your purchase price between the building and the land, and you only depreciate the building part over a set schedule, like 27.5 years for residential rental property.
And this depreciation, this is what creates the famous tax shelter aspect of real estate investing.
Exactly. That depreciation deduction is huge because it's a non-cash expense. It reduces your taxable income on paper, even if the property is generating positive cash flow in reality.
So you can have money coming in, but legally report less income.
Precisely. The source material had a great example. A property might have generated over $8,000 in positive cash flow for the year, actual cash in the owner's pocket. Yeah. But after deducting mortgage interest and the depreciation allowance, the reported taxable income for that property was under $2,000. That gap, that difference between cash flow and taxable income, that's the power of the tax shelter. It lets you keep more of the money the property actually earns.
Okay, so it's clear that just knowing the numbers isn't enough. Financial success demands execution and execution. Well, that takes discipline. Let's pivot now to the behavioral side of things, the role of systems and habits.
Yeah, this takes us right into behavioral science territory. And what the research tells us, what the sources emphasize, is that long-term success really hinges on developing the right kind of habits, big wealth-building habits.
And the sources had a pretty stark take on this, didn't they?
They did. Quite uncompromising. The premise is there's no such thing as a neutral habit. Every single thing you do repeatedly is either pulling you up or dragging you down.
Additive or subtractive?
Exactly. Additive or subtractive to your financial health, your professional life, everything. There's no middle ground.
And the process for how any habit gets formed, good or bad, follows that well-known four-step loop.
Right. The science is pretty clear on the habit loop. It always starts with a cue. That's the trigger, the thing that kicks off the routine. Then comes the craving, the motivation, the desire for the outcome or feeling. After that is the response, that's the habit itself, the action you take. And finally, the reward, which satisfies that craving and tells your brain, hey, let's do that again. It reinforces the loop.
The tricky part is that so many of these happen without us even thinking about it.
That's the challenge. Many of our most ingrained habits become automatic, non-conscious. Which is why the first step in changing behavior has to be awareness, making the unconscious conscious.
I remember that quote from the sources, I think attributed to Carl Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That really hits home in a business context.
It really does. If you keep finding yourself, say, not following through on your marketing plan or failing to stick to a budget or avoiding making follow-up calls, that's not fate. That's probably the result of some unconscious limiting habits you haven't identified yet.
So for consistency, especially if you're trying to scale up an investment business and need predictable results, the answer isn't just more willpower, right? It's systems.
Exactly. Willpower is finite, it gets exhausted. Systems, on the other hand, provide the structure. They create the opportunities and ensure you get consistent results, even when you don't feel motivated on, a rainy Tuesday morning.
So how do we really lock in success? What's the ultimate system?
The ultimate way to really lock in future behavior, as one source put it, is through automation, making good habits basically inevitable, and just as importantly, making bad habits difficult or impossible.
How do you automate habits?
It involves making strategic, one-time decisions that handle things for you going forward. Using commitment devices, for example, setting up automatic transfers for savings or investments, leveraging technology for reminders and follow-ups. You essentially design an environment where the desired action happens almost by default instead of constantly fighting internal resistance with willpower.
Okay, let's apply that systematic thinking to the actual physical properties. Starting with rental properties. There was a very blunt, but probably very true piece of advice in the sources about prepping a rental. Something about avoiding a major headache later.
Yes, simple but incredibly important wisdom. A dirty house attracts a dirty tenant. It is a fundamental and ultimately expensive mistake to try and rent out a house that's dirty, smelly, or clearly needs repairs.
Why is that such a big mistake?
Because if you present a dirty house, you signal that your standards are low. And you're likely to attract a tenant whose standards are also low, and who will likely leave the house even dirtier, needing much more costly work when they eventually move out.
Whereas spending a bit up front.
Right. A professional cleaning might cost, what, a few $100, maybe a fraction of 1 month's rent. But the return on that investment, starting with a genuinely pristine property, is massive. It sets a clear, non-negotiable standard for how the property should be kept.
And the source material pointed out something interesting about who often makes the final decision when a couple is looking at a rental property.
Yeah, that was a key insight for landlords. Often when a couple is viewing a rental, the woman tends to be the primary decision maker. And the preference is almost always for a clean, well-maintained place.
Why is that?
Often it comes down to the sources were pretty blunt about this too. Clutter is literally money lost. Failing to declutter, depersonalize, and stage effectively sells the property slower and for less money. That failure could easily cost the seller anywhere from $5,000 to potentially even $50,000 in price reductions they have to take.
Wow, $50,000, that's huge.
It's the high price of not appealing to the buyer's emotions, not helping them mentally move in and envision their life in that space. You're selling square footage, yes, but you're also selling a feeling, a future.
To make that practical for listeners, I really liked that specific rule they mentioned for making sure furniture doesn't overwhelm a room. The too much sofa rule.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic, really easy to use staging tool. The rule is simple. The total combined length of all your sofas and major seating pieces in, say, a living room should be no more than 2/3 the length of the longest wall in that room.
2/3, okay.
If you go over that ratio, if you have too much sofa, essentially it visually shrinks the room, makes it feel cramped, crowded. It's like trying to park a giant cruise ship in a tiny little marina. The furniture just dwarfs the space you're trying to showcase. Buyers subconsciously feel hemmed in.
And finally, staging isn't just about making it look nice generally, right? It needs to be targeted, avoiding things that specifically turn off the likely buyers, who are often from younger generations now.
Yes, absolutely. Buyers today, especially younger ones, are savvy. They watch HGTV, they have expectations, and there are definite generational don'ts. For instance, the sources strongly advised sellers targeting Gen Xers, who are often in their peak earning and buying years, to steer clear of linoleum flooring or any kind of gold fixture.
Turnoffs. Dated.
Exactly, seen as outdated. And for Gen Yers, the millennials, who are often first or second time buyers, they apparently have a particular aversion to pendant light fixtures. Any kind.
Really? Pendant lights?
That's what the source indicated. So good staging isn't just about making it generically attractive. It's about removing those specific visual friction points for your most likely buyer demographic. They want move-in ready, and certain things scream project, or outdated, hashtag tag staying mastering sales and negotiation.
Okay, whether you're an agent helping a client or an investor trying to buy a deal directly, negotiation is key. Let's talk about the sales process itself. The sources contrasted the sort of traditional, maybe old-school sales approach with something called the ninja consultation.
Right. Most people, when they first get into sales, are taught a pretty standard, often aggressive, three-step process. Step 1, connect, build some rapport. Step 2, present your product or service, focus on features and benefits. Step 3, close the deal, ask for the sale.
Okay, standard.
The ninja consultation model is different. It's a 4-step process, but the real key difference is where the emphasis lies. Old school training hammered home that the closing was the most important part, the bit that required the most skill and technique.
Right, the hard close.
Exactly. But modern research and the ninja approach completely flips that. It argues that the quality of that initial connection, how you set the stage, build trust, that's actually the most critical step. Get that right, and the rest flows much more easily.
That seems like a big philosophical shift. It's less about extracting a yes and more about facilitating.
That's the core idea behind the philosophy. Serve, don't sell. The goal isn't just to push for a commission or maximize your short-term gain. It's to act as a trusted advisor, a knowledgeable expert who serves the other party's needs with wisdom and respect.
Okay, let's get tactical. Moving into specific negotiation techniques. The sources mentioned a clever psychological play, especially for investors making offers. The two offers tactic. How does that work?
Yeah, this is a smart way to use price anchoring to your advantage. It works by shifting the seller's mental comparison point. Instead of just submitting one, probably low, offer that the seller might immediately compare to their high asking price and reject.
Right, because the gap looks huge.
Exactly. Instead, you submit 2 distinct offers simultaneously. For example, you might offer $150,000 cash with a really quick closing, maybe 10 days, and also offer $165,000. But that offer requires financing approval and might take 60 days to close.
Okay, so cash versus financed, speed versus price. How does the seller typically react to that?
Well, psychologically, their task changes. They stop comparing your lowball $150K offer to their emotional anchor of, say, $200K asking price, which feels like a massive insulting gap. Instead, they start thinking, okay, which of these two offers is better for me? They begin weighing the pros and cons. 150K fast and certain versus 165K slower and maybe less certain due to financing. They're now comparing your two options against each other, effectively ignoring their initial asking price as the main benchmark. This massively increases the chance they'll actually engage and counter one of your offers instead of just dismissing you out of hand.
That's clever, anchoring them to your numbers. Now, another psychological point the sources made was about the power of letting the other side say no early on. That sounds counterintuitive. Why would you want them to say no?
It really does sound backward because most negotiation advice is about getting to yes. But this technique is about building trust and comfort right from the start. It involves explicitly asking the other party what they don't want.
How would you phrase that?
You might say something like, look, I want to make sure we don't waste any of your time here. Could you tell me maybe 3 things you absolutely would say no to in any potential deal structure or offer?
And what does that achieve?
For the other person, defining their boundaries like that feels like an act of self-protection. It gives them a sense of control right away. They feel heard, empowered. And once they've exercised that power to say no, and you've acknowledged and respected those boundaries,
they feel safer.
Exactly. They often become much more relaxed, more open, more collaborative. They've asserted themselves, you've respected it, and now they're more willing to explore the things they might say yes to. It lowers their defenses.
Okay, we've drilled down into individual strategies and tactics. But, your success always happens within a bigger picture, right? The macro environment. To really illustrate how drastically things can change, let's look back at market history. The sources break down post-war investment performance into 4 pretty distinct eras.
Yeah, looking at that long-term data for stocks and bonds going back to, 1947, it really shows these massive swings in market personality and economic conditions. It's not a smooth ride at all.
So what was Era 1?
Era 1, the Age of Comfort. This was roughly 1947 to 1968. Think post-World War II boom. Rebuilding, U.S. corporate dominance growing, stable currency. Stocks, measured by the S&P 500, had just phenomenal returns, averaged 14.0% per year. Bonds, though, were pretty sleepy, yielding only about 1.8% because inflation was low. Basically, buy and hold stocks, you did great.
Sounds nice. What came next?
Era 2, the Age of Angst. Roughly 1969 to 1981. This period was chaotic. High instability, Vietnam War fallout, social upheaval, and crucially, runaway inflation. Inflation averaged like 7.8% a year.
Ouch. What did that do to returns?
Killed them. Stock returns crashed down to just 5.6% annually. Bonds did a little better, maybe 3.8%. But here's the kicker. With inflation so high, both stocks and bonds were barely keeping pace, or often losing ground in terms of real purchasing power. Inflation was the big enemy here.
Okay, angst. Then things must have gotten better.
Dramatically better. Era Thur, the age of exuberance. Roughly 1982 to 2000, this was the monster bull market, driven by things like lower interest rates eventually, maybe some regulatory changes, and a big demographic tailwind, baby boomers hitting their prime saving and investing years.
And the returns.
Huge. Stocks exploded 18.3% average annual return. And even bonds did incredibly well, averaging 13.6%. This era basically created a whole generation of investors who came to believe that these kinds of high returns were just
normal,
the default setting.
Which set them up for a shock in the next era, I assume.
A massive shock. Era 5. The age of disenchantment. Roughly 2000 to 2009. This decade was just brutal for stock investors. You had two major bubbles burst. The dot-com crash right at the beginning, and then the housing crisis and financial meltdown later. Over that whole decade, common stocks actually lost money. The average annual return was a soul-crushing negative 6.5%.
Minus 6.5% per year for a decade. Wow.
Yeah. Bonds, interestingly, became the safe haven. They returned a pretty solid 6.4% during that time.
The lesson here seems pretty stark. Market conditions aren't stable. They can shift dramatically and stay shifted for a long time. That age of exuberance gave way immediately to disenchantment, which really highlights the need for diversification, doesn't it? Not just stocks versus bonds, but maybe globally.
Absolutely. The sources make a very strong case for international diversification as a way to smooth out the ride and reduce risk. Including foreign stocks, the benchmark often used is the MSCI EAFE index, which covers developed markets outside North America, makes your overall portfolio less volatile.
Why is that? Do they move differently?
They often do. The statistical measure is correlation. Over the long haul, the correlation between U.S. stocks and developed foreign stocks was only around 0.5. A correlation of 1 means they move in perfect lockstep. 0 means no relationship. Make it 1 means opposite moves. So 0.5 shows they move together somewhat, but not perfectly.
Meaning sometimes when the U.S. market is down, foreign markets might be up or less down.
Exactly. That imperfect correlation provides a buffer. It gives you protection against shocks that might hit just one country or region's economy. It dampens the swings in your overall portfolio.
Okay, and sticking with portfolio strategy, when it comes to actually implementing this, especially in the stock market, the advice seems to consistently come back to index funds, the index fund solution.
Yeah.
Why is that? It seems counterintuitive when you see all the ads for brilliant active fund managers.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive, but the data is overwhelming. Passive index funds tend to beat the vast majority of actively managed funds over the long term, and there are two really simple fundamental reasons why. Math, basically.
What are they?
First, costs. Specifically, management fees. Index funds have incredibly low fees, sometimes as low as like 1/20th of 1% per year, 0.05%. Actively managed funds, on average, charge closer to 1 full percentage point per year, sometimes more. That's a huge difference that compounds over time.
Okay, fees. What's the second reason?
Trading costs. Index funds mostly buy and hold the stocks in their index. They only really trade when the index itself changes or to handle cash flows in and out. Minimal trading. Active funds, on the other hand, are constantly buying and selling, trying to beat the market. Their turnover rates can be close to 100% per year, meaning they're essentially replacing their whole portfolio every year.
And all that trading costs money.
Lots of money. Brokerage commissions, bid-ask spreads. It adds up. So here's the logic. Active managers, as a group, are the market before costs. They can't collectively beat the average. Once you subtract their much higher management fees and their higher trading costs, they must mathematically underperform the low-cost index fund over time. It's almost a guaranteed formula for lagging the market average. #, B, real estate and the subprime crisis.
Okay, let's shift back to real estate finance. Specifically, that massive crash, the 2008 crisis. The sources described it as being rooted in, well, institutional fraud around mortgage bonds. We need to unpack the mechanics of those infamous CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and how Wall Street made them look safe when they really weren't.
Yeah, this is where things went from maybe complex financial engineering to outright deception. It started with subprime mortgages loans to borrowers with weaker credit. These were risky. They got bundled together into mortgage bonds, many of which were rated BBB. That's basically the lowest rung of investment grade, bordering on junk, high risk.
Okay, so risky bonds made of risky loans.
Right. Then, Wall Street took these BBB-rated bonds, the riskiest slice, and piled them into new structures called CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. The real trick, the deception, was in how they sliced up this new structure, the CDO, into different layers or tranches and got the rating agencies to bless them.
How did they manage that?
They basically used flawed models and, frankly, conspired with the rating agencies. They convinced them that because the CDO contained bonds from different geographic areas, it was diversified. Even though all the underlying loans were subprime mortgages, highly vulnerable to the exact same risk, namely falling house prices nationwide.
So they ignored the correlated risk.
Completely. They pretended these loans were independent risks, like unrelated coin flips, which was fundamentally untrue. If one subprime borrower defaulted because house prices fell and they couldn't refinance, chances were the subprime borrower next door, facing the same economic pressure, would default too.
So what was the result of this rating game? How safe did these CDOs look on paper?
Astonishingly safe. Because of this flawed structure and the rating agencies playing along, 80% of the typical CDO built from risky BBB mortgage bonds ended up being rated higher than BBB. They got stamped AAA, AA, or A investment grade.
80%. Made from risky stuff.
80%. They essentially turned lead into gold on paper, calling it safe investment grade when the foundation was built on the riskiest mortgages imaginable.
Which means the whole structure must have been incredibly fragile underneath that shiny rating. How much trouble in the actual underlying mortgages did it take to blow the whole thing up?
Shockingly little. The way these things were structured, particularly the CDOs made primarily from those BBB bonds, it only took about a 7% loss rate on the underlying home loans to completely wipe out the entire BBB-rated equity tranche at the bottom of the CDO structure.
Just 7% defaults or losses.
Roughly 7%. Once that bottom layer was gone, losses started hitting the next layer up the mezzanine tranches, maybe rated A or AA, and the dominoes just started falling incredibly fast. That same tiny 7% loss rate was enough to make many of these supposedly safe CDOs worthless. Systemic risk disguised as diversification.
Yeah, and the aftermath. It's maybe the most galling part. The global economy takes a massive hit, governments bail out banks, millions lose homes. But many of the individuals involved, even those who made huge losing bets, walked away rich.
That's the stark reality that justifiably fueled so much public anger and eroded trust. The sources mention specific examples. Howie Hubler, a trader at Morgan Stanley, made arguably the single biggest bad bet in Wall Street history, losing billions for the bank.
Yet he was reportedly allowed to keep tens of millions in past earnings.
Unbelievable. Wing Chao, whose business was managing these toxic CDOs, saw it collapse, but he also apparently left with tens of millions personally. Meanwhile, huge institutional investors like the government of Singapore Investment Corporation took massive hits, hundreds of millions in losses on these things. Yet many of the executives at the firms responsible, the ones driving this, still received huge bonuses or golden parachutes.
So the losses got socialized, but the gains were privatized.
That's exactly how it looked. It highlighted a system where the downside risk was ultimately borne by taxpayers and the wider economy, while the upside, even when generated through reckless or fraudulent behavior, was often protected for the individuals at the top. #C, the legacy of policy and urbanization.
Let's zoom out even further now historically. How did government policy and the way our cities and suburbs developed actually shape where wealth could even be built over the last century, particularly that big shift towards the suburbs?
Yeah, the whole suburban ideal, which really defines how so many Americans live, didn't just happen randomly. It was enabled by two really key structural changes according to the sources. First, mass transportation, especially railroads initially. They actively encouraged development further out from city centers and offered commuter services.
Okay, transport. What was the second thing?
A revolution in building technology. The balloon frame house. This new construction method used standardized lighter lumber, like 2x4s, and nails, making houses much faster and cheaper to build compared to older, heavy timber framing.
So it made standalone homes affordable for more people.
Exactly. It democratized the single-family home, making it accessible to middle-income families. This technological shift, combined with mass production techniques, enabled the rapid creation of huge suburban developments like Levittown after World War II.
But as we know, this wave of opportunity wasn't shared equally. You mentioned policy biases earlier. How did government policy actively favor certain types of development and transportation over others?
There was a massive systemic bias built into policy, and its effects are still with us. Essentially, private transportation cars, highways, roads was heavily favored. Road building became defined as a national public good, heavily subsidized by general taxpayer funds.
Okay. And mass transit.
Mass transit, like streetcar systems, which were once extensive in American cities, received comparatively little support. In fact, policy often required them to pay for themselves entirely through fares. This led to their decline, especially compared to robust public transit systems in Europe, even by the early 1900s.
So we subsidize driving, but not shared transit.
Pretty much. And this focus on cars and roads had a detrimental effect on older urban neighborhoods, too. Streets that were once community gathering places got turned into congested traffic arteries, benefiting the new suburbs but often damaging the fabric of the established city.
And perhaps the most damaging policy bias, certainly in terms of wealth creation, was the deliberate government-backed segregation that locked entire groups out of this suburban boom.
This is a critical and often uncomfortable historical truth. Mid-20th century government policy, especially through hugely influential programs like the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and Veterans Administration, VA loan insurance, these programs didn't just allow segregation, they often mandated it.
Ow.
Their underwriting manuals explicitly advised against inharmonious racial or nationality groups and promoted racially restrictive covenants. They deemed integrated neighborhoods too risky to insure loans in. This effectively denied African-American families, even veterans with VA eligibility, the ability to get the government-backed mortgages needed to buy homes in thousands of new white-only suburbs like the famous Levittown.
They were explicitly shut out of the primary engine of middle-class wealth building.
Completely shut out.
What was the quantifiable financial impact of that exclusion over the generations?
The numbers cited in the sources are just staggering. Those white working-class families, often veterans, who were able to buy a Levittown home back in, say, 1948, using a low-cost, government-insured mortgage, they gained more than $200,000 in wealth over the next 3 generations, just from the equity growth and forced savings inherent in homeownership.
$200,000 in generational wealth.
Minimum. Meanwhile, African-American families, barred from those same opportunities, forced to remain renters or maybe buy in less desirable urban areas without the subsidies. They gain almost no equity during that same period. Government policy was an active participant in creating and massively exacerbating the racial wealth gap that still persists today. It's a direct line.
Okay, to kind of wrap up this deep dive into all the complex forces swirling around financial decisions, we should probably touch on some of the things shaping the current mood, the zeitgeist, the stuff causing anxiety and maybe influencing behavior today.
Right. We're definitely living in a time of, well, unprecedented change. Information overload, rapid technological shifts. The sources definitely acknowledge this feeling of unease that many people have. One source even flatly stated something like, the world as we know it today will be gone by 2030.
That's a pretty jarring statement.
It is. And that kind of prediction, that feeling of radical uncertainty about the future, it naturally fuels a lot of anxiety. How do you plan? How do you save? How do you invest when the ground feels like it's constantly shifting underneath you? That sense of losing control is palpable.
And that anxiety seems to manifest in different ways, right?
Yep.
Sometimes focusing on powerful individuals, sometimes on big, maybe opaque technological changes.
Exactly. The sources noted commentary reflecting anxieties around certain high-profile figures. The text mentioned names like Musk and Gates, perceived by some as having almost unchecked power, sort of self-styled masters of the earth, representing extreme wealth and technological influence, which can feel unsettling.
And technology itself.
Simultaneously, the sources mentioned anxiety swirling around things like vaccines or 5G technology, noting that these specific, highly publicized topics are often framed by certain groups as sources of anxiety about, hidden agendas, manipulation, and control over information. We're just reporting what the sources highlight as contemporary anxieties.
Right. And this theme of fighting for control over information, over the narrative, it brings to mind a major historical parallel: Watergate. The sources touched on this, particularly the work of Woodward and Bernstein-Woodstein. That whole saga really shows how hard it is to get to the truth when powerful institutions want to hide it.
It absolutely does. And the scale of the corruption revealed back then was just chilling. Deep Throat, their key source, eventually told them that it wasn't just a few rogue actors, it was more than 50 people, directed from the White House and the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, involved in operations designed to sabotage political opponents and subvert the whole democratic process.
More than 50 people. It wasn't just the burglary.
No, it was widespread. Things like breaking into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, trying to dig up dirt, having the Secret Service pass along damaging personal information about a rival candidate to the White House. It was a concerted effort at information control and political destruction using illegal and quasi-legal means.
And the official response from the government at the time was basically denial and attacking the messengers, right? Attacking the press.
That's right. The tension was incredibly high. L. Patrick Gray III, who was the acting FBI director then, actually ordered a major internal investigation specifically to find out who was leaking information to the Washington Post. Meanwhile, the White House public strategy was often just flat denial, dismissing the Post stories as based on hearsay, or making token gestures of cooperation that were really just, as the source put it, carefully managed public relations gestures.
It really underscores that age-old dynamic.
Yeah.
When powerful entities want to control an outcome, whether it's political or financial, controlling the narrative, controlling the truth, is often the first battleground.
Absolutely. Information is power. #tag outro.
Wow. What an incredible deep dive that was. We went from the really granular stuff, like how much clutter might actually cost you, the precise steps of BRRR, those unforgiving 231 deadlines.
Yeah, the micro-level mechanic.
All the way up to these huge systemic forces, the inherent risks of leverage, the wild swings across those 4 different market eras, the, frankly, dark history of how government policy created segregated wealth opportunities.
And how that directly impacted families for generations. We really scaled up from individual action to macro context, even touching on modern anxieties about information and control. Hopefully pulling all these threads together, the micro and the macro gives you a more complete picture for making decisions in what is, let's face it, a pretty chaotic world.
So what's the takeaway here for you, the listener, the individual investor navigating all this?
Well, the world is complex. It is chaotic. We've seen markets swing wildly between exuberance and disenchantment. We saw the global financial system nearly brought down by what was essentially easily preventable fraud hidden inside those CDOs. And that constant volatility, that complexity, it really presents you with a choice. You can try to become a master of everything, constantly chasing the next macro trend, trying to guess which investment era we're heading into next, which is incredibly difficult, maybe impossible. Or you can choose focused mastery. The sources alluded to this. Consider the successful investor who, instead of dabbling in dozens of complex strategies, decided to become the absolute best at just one thing. Maybe like mastering subject to acquisitions, buying properties subject to the existing financing, sometimes for literally $1 down. They focused, they mastered it, and they built a successful career doing just that, largely ignoring the macro noise.
So the final thought is about focus.
I think so. The power ultimately might lie less in trying to predict the chaotic world and more in choosing what you will master and focusing your energy there, whether you bet on navigating complexity or achieving simple, repeatable mastery. That choice, at the end of the day, belongs entirely to you.